Okay, so the last two parts of this chapter, part 4 and 5, are about food and water safety. So obviously, in addition to having access to abundant variety, nutrient-dense foods, we also have to have a safe food and water supply to support good health. Technology, laws, and regulations have really led to a steep decline in foodborne and waterborne illnesses. However, they still do happen. In North America, in the United States and Canada, we do enjoy a relatively safe water and food supply, but again, pathogens and chemicals in foods and in water still pose a health risk. Much less than in developing countries, but still there. Okay, foodborne illness is caused by ingestion of pathogens or their toxins, and that's obviously a health problem. The CDC, which stands for the Center for Disease Control, they have estimated that foodborne pathogens cause about 48 million illnesses annually. Probably higher because most cases are thought to go undiagnosed. There are about 128,000 hospitalizations per year and over 3,000 deaths attributed to foodborne illness. 80% of the cases, the specific microbial pathogen is not found. It's not known. Symptoms of foodborne illness are generally in the GI tract. They're gastrointestinal, so things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and intestinal cramping are common symptoms from foodborne illness. There are certain members of the population in the United States that are at a higher risk for foodborne illness. So people that are immunocompromised, their immune system is not functioning at 100%. Pregnant women, infants and young children, the elderly, so the very young and the very old, and individuals who reside in institutional settings and individuals who are homeless. They are at a higher risk for getting a foodborne illness. Okay. Foodborne illness can be in an outbreak. And so a foodborne illness outbreak is when two or more individuals end up with the same illness from the same contaminated food or beverage. Most outbreaks are going to occur in small groups in localized, distinct regions, areas. When contamination occurs, however, many people could be affected because the food that we eat is grown on large farms and it's transported to processing plants or supermarkets, and many people could be infected because food came from the same farm or it was processed in the same plant, and it ends up in supermarkets that could be in multiple states throughout the United States. So there are multi-state outbreaks that do happen. For example, there was a frozen blueberry multi-state outbreak. There's been multi-state outbreaks with cucumbers, spinach, salad mixes, peanuts, pistachios, poultry, ground meat, ice cream, chocolate chip cookie dough. Okay, so multi-state outbreaks can occur. Food mishandling in food service establishments, restaurants, and in in-home kitchens can also lead to foodborne illness. Okay, so we'll get into a little bit more specifics. So microbial pathogens that cause foodborne illness. The greatest risk for contamination are by viruses and bacteria. To a lesser extent, we can get contamination from fungi and parasites. These are all potential sources, of contamination. Illness is going to occur when the microbes are either directly ingested into the GI tract, so we would call that a foodborne infection. So the virus, the bacteria, the fungi, the parasite, whatever it is ingested and wreaks havoc in the GI tract. That's a foodborne infection. You're infected with the pathogen. There's also something called a foodborne intoxication. And so here the individual doesn't ingest the pathogen itself, instead it ingests a toxin that was secreted into or onto the food that we eat. So that's called the foodborne intoxication. So that's the ingestion of a toxin. The toxin would be produced from the pathogen, but the pathogen itself isn't causing, isn't ingested, isn't causing the problem, the illness. Okay. Most bacteria and viruses that cause foodborne illness originate in an infected human or animal. So that's usually the source. There are well-defined routes in which food gets contaminated. So the route could be fecal-oral. So the pathogen or its toxins are in fecal matter, either human or animal, and the feces ends up in food. Okay, again, not washing hands after using a restroom, not washing hands after being with pets, things like that. So that's the fecal-oral route. So feces is ingested that contains the microorganism or its toxins. I should say feces is ingested on food, and that feces would contain the pathogen. There is also direct contamination by an infected individual. And so, for example, an individual who's handling food may have an open wound, and that open wound, could touch the food, or a hand could touch the open wound that touches the food, and so the organism makes its way onto the food that way. An individual could cough or sneeze onto food, and that would put the organism onto the food. An animal could have an open wound, or same thing, cough or sneeze or lick, food, and that could end up putting an organism onto that food. And then cross-contamination. So cross-contamination is where you have uncontaminated food doesn't have any pathogen or toxins on it, and that comes in contact with a contaminated food or an object like a plate, a knife, a cutting board. So for example, if you're cutting chicken on a cutting board and it's not washed properly, and then you go ahead and you cut up, fresh vegetables, maybe for a salad, if there was pathogen on that chicken, it's on the cutting board, it's on the knife, it's now on your vegetables. So that would be cross-contamination. Okay. So, animals raised on farms, animals raised for meat can harbor harmful microorganisms. Crops could be contaminated with pollutants from irrigation, runoff from streams, microorganisms or toxins in soil or pesticides. So contamination can happen at the farm. Contamination can also happen at the slaughterhouse. It can happen during harvesting, sorting of produce. It can happen during washing, packaging. All of that stuff happens, at the farm. Some foods, such as produce, may go from the farm directly to market. So all the processing and packaging and washing is done there at the farm. And then some foods may actually be processed in a separate facility. And so at each site, so at the farm, at the processing center, maybe there's multiple processing centers, there is that chance that contamination can happen at every step of the way. There are federal standards, such as cleaning protocols, testing, and training that can help prevent contamination. But again, you've got multiple layers here where contamination can happen. Then it needs to be transported from the farm or from the processing plant. And when it's transported, it needs to be transported in a clean, refrigerated vehicle. That's going to help prevent the multiplication of microorganisms and prevent the production of microbial toxins. Retail. So when food gets to the store, you've got employees of food markets or of restaurants that could potentially contaminate food during storage, preparation. There might be inadequate refrigeration or heating that can promote the growth of microorganisms. establishments have to follow FDA guidelines for food safety and pass health inspections, but again, multiple layers where, contamination could happen. At the table, consumers may contaminate food with unclean hands, unclean utensils, unclean surfaces. They can allow multiplication of organisms and their toxins by failing to follow food safety guidelines for storing, preparing, cooking, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so again, multiple chances for contamination of food. There is regulation, but there's multiple chances. So let's talk about some of these microbes. And so pictured here are single-celled bacteria. Is actually a bunch of single-celled rod-shaped bacteria. So bacteria are single-celled microscopic organisms. You need a microscope to view them. They are found everywhere. Most bacteria are harmless. They're living on you and in you right now. They're part of your normal microbiota, which is extremely important to your health. We need bacteria. We just don't need pathogenic ones. Okay, so pathogenic bacteria are those that cause disease. Common sources of pathogenic bacteria are raw and undercooked meats. It's really important to cook meat to the proper internal temperature to kill pathogenic bacteria. So meat, poultry, same thing. Eggs could harbor pathogenic bacteria, fish, shellfish, unpasteurized dairy products like raw milk. Pasteurization is so important. Nuts and fresh produce. Okay. I'm going to keep showing this table kind of over and over again. It's repeated throughout the notes. Oh no, this one's not. Is it? No, I'm sorry, this one's not. This is the only spot that it is. So I'm not going to go through everything on this table or these tables. These are different bacterial species. Some of these you will be asked about in some of the activities that you have to do. So different bacteria, typical food source that they're found on, symptoms if somebody gets infected or intoxicated with either the bacteria or its toxins, and then additional information that's relevant. Let me just do the first one. So salmonella, it's probably something that you've all heard of. There's a couple on here that you probably heard of, like E. coli, salmonella. Most of you guys have probably heard of Clostridium botulinum. You've heard of the botulism toxin, probably. So salmonella species, you can find salmonella on foods like raw and undercooked meat, poultry, eggs, and fish, especially raw sprouts, peanut butter, and unpasteurized milk. So again, pasteurization of milk is very important. Cooking your meat, your eggs, to the right temperature is important. Onset of symptoms 6 to 27 hours after consumption. Nausea, fever, headache, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, vomiting. Can be fatal in infants, very dangerous, older adults, and those with compromised immune systems. In healthy individuals, it usually lasts about 4 to 7 days. So, a type of food poisoning. Okay. Again, I'm not going to read you all of these, but you'll have to look some of them up. Okay, a little bit more information about bacteria. They require nutrients, water, and warmth to proliferate. Most grow best, and there's different types of bacteria that have different preferences, but most grow best in what's called the danger zone temperature. So between 41 and 135 degrees Celsius. So, your refrigerator should be set under degrees Fahrenheit. Your refrigerator should be set under 41 degrees Fahrenheit, to limit growth. Okay. You can see in this infographic here, 41 and below, that's the recommended refrigerator temperature. There are still some bacteria that can grow. If you're not going to, use, let's say, meat, for example, for a couple of days, chicken or beef, you should freeze it. So in the freezer, bacteria can't grow. They may survive. Growth can resume upon thawing, so you have to be careful with that. But again, refrigeration slows the growth. Freezing will inhibit growth, but they can sometimes grow after you thaw them. The danger zone here between 41 and 135, this should be up a little bit more, degrees Fahrenheit, bacteria grow quickly. So don't store within this temperature range for more than 1 to 2 hours. So you shouldn't have meat out in the counter of your house for a prolonged period of time. Even 1 to 2 hours, I think, is pushing it. And then above this, so temperature range for holding thoroughly cooked food. So if you're going to cook food and keep it out, you need to hold it at this temperature range here. It prevents the growth of bacteria, but it doesn't necessarily destroy them. So 135 to 165-ish. And then here in this range, this is a temperature range for destroying bacteria, not their spores, parasitic worms and protozoa. So you want to, cook food appropriately. And then above 212, this is what we need for canning. And there's different types of canning. Canning low acid foods and pressure canning. Okay. So again, you want to avoid that danger zone. You don't want to keep food at those temperatures for a prolonged period of time. Bacteria also many bacteria like oxygen-rich environments, and most bacteria will prefer non-acidic environments. Higher temperatures can kill bacteria, but they won't. Their spores may not be inactivated, and their toxins won't be inactivated. And so you have to remember that. So, for example, if I go back a slide, and we look at Clostridium botulinum here. So typical sources: incorrectly home-canned vegetables, meats, and fish, incorrectly canned commercial foods, herb-infused oils, bottled garlics, potatoes baked in foil and held at room temperature, honey. So these are all typical foods that we can get Clostridium botulinum. This produces botulinum toxin. And so even, if you heat this up, you're not going to destroy the toxin. It can still be present. Okay. And various bacteria do produce toxins. Okay, viruses. So we're on to viruses. Viruses are also widely dispersed in nature. However, they, unlike bacteria, they need a host cell in order to replicate and survive. So that's a big difference. The key to preventing illnesses caused by viruses is to use sanitary food preparation practices. Wash your hands, before you eat. Wear gloves if you're a food server. Make sure you're washing your hands before you handle food. Don't cough or sneeze on food. All of those things. There's two main viruses that we'll just touch on. So norovirus and hepatitis A virus. So norovirus, typical food sources: food prepared by infected individuals, shellfish from contaminated waters, vegetables and fruits contaminated during growing, harvesting, and processing. 1 to 2 days of stomach flu, severe diarrhea, vomiting, stomach cramping, low-grade fever, muscle aches usually lasts about 1 to 2 days. Estimated 5.5 infections per year. Save it on here, but this is common on cruise ships. I thought it said it. So very common on cruise ships. You're in close proximity to each other. Many times you're eating off of a buffet. So just use your judgment there. Hepatitis A virus, again, usually from food that's prepared by infected handlers, food that's undercooked, or handled after cooking, such as sandwiches, pastries, salads, so on and so forth. There is, I don't know if I put this anywhere, there is a vaccine for hepatitis A that, oh yeah, there it is right there. The vaccine is available, and so if you get the vaccine, you're probably not going to get hepatitis A. And there's also other treatments for that if you are infected with it. Okay, parasites, we'll go through this pretty quick. Again, I'm not going to go through this whole table with you. Parasites live on or in another organism. They're spread from person to person via contact with food, contaminated food, water, soil. Most common in tropical countries with poor sanitation. We didn't really have too many cases in the U.S., but I guess it's on the rise. More than 80 foodborne parasites affect humans. Protozoa are one-celled animals. And then helminths, like you've probably heard of tapeworms and roundworms. Those are all examples. Well, those are both examples of parasites. Okay, and so again, we give you some examples here: Trichinella spiralis, tapeworms, Toxoplasma gondii. So again, all different types of potential foodborne illnesses, caused by these parasites. Okay, prions. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. Prions are not living; they are infectious protein particles that will affect the nervous system. They cause something called TSEs, transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. So again, affecting the brain and spinal cord, extremely rare in humans. But if a human eats meat from cattle that have this, there is the potential for infection. In the 80s and 90s, there was a few outbreaks in the UK. There are strict guidelines in place in the United States. And eating beef in the United States, you're not at risk for contracting this. Okay. Let me go back. I just want to mention the outbreaks. You may have heard of mad cow disease. That's what this is. So again, it's not a living organism. It's not a toxin. It's a protein particle found in those foods. Okay, and it affects the brain and spinal cord. Okay, toxins. So toxins not only can be produced by bacteria, but they can also be produced by molds, algae, and plants. And again, I don't want to go through this whole table with you. You can take a minute and kind of look through these. Some of these you may have heard of, like aflatoxins. Aflatoxins are from the fungus Aspergillus. Typical food sources: corn, peanuts, rice, wheat, spices. There's acute toxicity, and then there's chronic toxicity. Aflatoxin B is the most common fungal toxin. Causes significant crop loss, and it causes disease when consumed by humans. There have been human illnesses caused by aflatoxins in the United States. Okay. Yeah, I'll mention this one too. Solanine. This is a potato here with some growing roots, maybe some stems. So potato sprouts, green spots on potato skin. You should cut these off before cooking potatoes. You don't need to throw the whole potato out if the whole thing is not green. But you should, store your potatoes in dark places. You should discard sprouts, peel, bruises, cut areas, any areas that have a green tinge to them. You don't want to eat the green spots on potatoes. This compound, it has an onset of 8 to 12 hours. It can cause nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, hallucinations, loss of sensation, and paralysis. So again, dangerous. Okay. All right, let's go on. Again, I don't want to go over the whole table, although it's very interesting. Molds, just like bacteria, they need water, so they prefer moist environments. Molds also prefer dark environments. Molds can form endospores on the outside of foods, which can give them this fuzzy, colorful appearance. You've all seen mold probably growing on bread or cheese or fresh produce. Those are the most likely sources of molds. Thousands of different species of molds can grow on foods. Most molds just add color, texture, taste, or food odors, but some of them do produce mycotoxins. So myco meaning from a mushroom, and toxin, is a toxin. These mycotoxins can cause a variety of terrible symptoms like blood disease, nervous system disorders, kidney and liver damage. The most important are aflatoxins, which is one of the ones that I went through, produced by Aspergillus. It can cause liver damage, and then ergot is another one. This can cause hallucination, constriction of blood flow. Rarely a problem in industrial countries like the United States because we have good food production practices and regulations. So again, not usually a problem, but okay. Here we are again, toxins in seafood. And so, I skipped ahead to plant toxins with solanine. So I should have only talked about aflatoxin and ergot. Sorry about that. So ergot, I mentioned it, what it can cause, right? So fish and shellfish we'll do now. And there's a couple here, 4 of these, that can cause problems. I'm not going to go over all of those. But again, toxins can be found in seafood. Toxin-containing algae can be ingested by some fish and shellfish, and they can cause foodborne illness. So that's, you're eating algae, usually produced by toxins produced by algae. There's 2 different types here. So Ciguatera toxin, this is the most common in large fish from tropical waters, can cause GI problems, neuromuscular problems, respiratory problems. And then you could also get what's called shellfish poisoning. This is paralysis caused by, again, eating shellfish contaminated with algae. The fish and the shellfish usually are unharmed, but they carry this algae that produces a toxin. Toxins are not destroyed by cooking or by freezing. So that doesn't fix it. Okay. On to plants, which I already talked about, the one that I wanted to talk about, but that's okay. So there's a variety of different toxins that can be produced by plants. And again, if ingested, can cause a variety of different things. So plants naturally produce toxins for their own protection, to compete with neighboring plants and to protect themselves from predators. Rarely do they cause illness in humans, but sometimes the production of these toxins increases if a plant is stressed. So for example, this is that solanine that I was talking about. This can be produced by potatoes. It causes these green areas. And so again, you want to definitely cut these off. These green areas can form when potatoes start to sprout and they're stored in a brightly lit place. Okay, so proper storage of potatoes should prevent this. But again, you don't want to eat it. Okay, we're coming to the end here. So here's the table just one more time. Again, I don't want to go through everything on here, but toxins can be produced by molds, by algae, and by plants. Okay, on to water safety. So again, we want to have food that is not infected with pathogens or their products, and we also want to have safe water. And so water is going to be regulated by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, it states that all public water suppliers, municipal water suppliers, are required to test for contaminants such as bacteria, various chemicals, heavy metals like lead and arsenic, and that those tests must be submitted, the results of those tests must be submitted to the EPA. Okay, so the EPA is going to monitor that. Water treatments vary at different municipalities, but for the most part, water is disinfected with a chlorine-based chemical. Private water suppliers, so if you have a property that has a well on it, those are not regulated by the EPA. Homeowners should test for chemicals and microbial contaminants to make sure that they're drinking safe water. Okay, bottled water. Bottled water has to list the source of water on the label. Some water, bottled water comes from, natural springs or mineral springs. A lot of it is from municipalities. So you should really look at the label. You don't want to pay for bottled water that came from your municipality or a neighboring municipality. It's probably the same as from your faucet. Some will contain minerals, could be naturally, could be added. Some will contain vitamins, flavorings. They may be carbonated. Again, these are regulated, not by the EPA, but by the FDA. They're considered to be food. There are threats to water, agricultural runoff from farms, inappropriate disposal of chemicals that can make their way into our water supply, municipal solid wastes, inadequate treatment of human wastes, and pollution from boats and ships. Preventing foodborne and waterborne illnesses. Again, there's a lot of agencies that are involved in protecting us, protecting consumers. Safe food and water requires what we call the farm to fork approach, right? So everybody involved in the process, from growers, processors, distributors, and us as consumers, we're responsible for making sure at every level, that our food and water is clean. There are government agencies to regulate and monitor that as well, to make sure that everybody is doing the right thing. And so here's a list, and what they regulate. Preventing food and waterborne illness, for ourselves, you want to make sure that you have good personal and kitchen hygiene. You want to make sure that when you're thawing food, that you're thawing food appropriately. There are guidelines for how to thaw food, meats especially, properly. You want to make sure that you're cooking foods to the appropriate internal temperature. You want to make sure that you're storing foods appropriately, for the right amount of time. You don't want to leave meat in your refrigerator for an extended period of time. It should go in the freezer or be cooked. And you should know which foods pose an extra risk. Okay. Here are some minimum safe cooking temperatures. This is kind of interesting. So you want to make sure that you hit the internal temperature, that are listed here. So, for example, if you had a whole chicken or turkey breast, that internal temperature needs to come to 165 degrees Fahrenheit before turning off that oven. Okay. So you want to make sure that you're using good kitchen practices. Okay, last part of this chapter. It's not too long, so we'll do it within this video. Environmental contaminants that can make their way into food. So common environmental contaminants include heavy metals like lead and mercury, industrial chemicals like dioxins and polychlorinate biphenyls, PCBs for short, and then agricultural chemicals like antibiotics and pesticides. So we're going to cover some of these. Let's do lead first. And so first and foremost off the bat, there is no safe level of lead that should make its way into our body and into our bloodstream. There's no safe level. It damages every organ in the body, especially the nervous system and kidneys. It impairs the synthesis of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the molecule in our red blood cells that's responsible for carrying oxygen. So again, very, very damaging. It's very toxic to the development of nervous systems of children, especially. Children who have lead poisoning end up with lower IQs, behavioral disorders, impaired coordination, growth, and hearing, predisposes children to high blood pressure and to kidney disorders. Where do people pick up lead? So there are, a variety of sources. Some of them are food. So home plumbing, lead-based paints, which are more likely to have been used in buildings built before 1986, when we stopped using lead-based paints. Lead containing containers, like lead crystal and some pottery. Some candies from Mexico contain lead. Vegetables grown in contaminated soil, so there's a food source. Some dietary supplements. Toys painted with lead containing paints. Lead bullets used for hunting. So again, there's multiple sources, but again, our concern would be the food sources. On to arsenic. So again, another heavy metal. Sources of this: soil and water. It's found in the environment. It is toxic and carcinogenic. It can lead to poor fetal growth. So pregnant women should really avoid, exposure to arsenic. It can affect the immune and neurodevelopment in children. It can lead to cancer in in adults. Sorry. Rice is a major source of arsenic, especially brown rice. On to PCBs. Okay, dioxins and PCBs. Both of these chemicals are byproducts of industrial processes and the incineration of waste materials. Both of these increase the risk of cancer. They can cause liver and nerve damage. They may have adverse effects on reproduction. They can increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. PCBs have been classified as something called obesogens. These are, again, environmental chemicals that disrupt the endocrine system, and they promote fat production and accumulation in the body. Food sources: eating fish from contaminated waterways. Okay, so you want to make sure you know where you're getting your fish from if you're eating it. Okay. Okay, mercury. Again, mercury, so in aquatic environments, bacteria will convert mercury to something called methylmercury, which is the dangerous form here. It can cause nerve damage, fatigue, and poor learning abilities. Fish are a primary food source, which can contain this neurotoxin. So fish eat the bacteria contain methylmercury, the fish now have the neurotoxin. Who's most at risk? Children, pregnant women. It can cause birth defects, and breastfeeding women. Okay. There are guidelines put out by the EPA and the FDA about how much fish should be consumed. We definitely want to limit the mercury in our diet. Again, this is really important for developing children, women who are or may become pregnant, and women who are breastfeeding. So again, it's recommended that we eat 8 to 12 ounces of a variety of fish a week. Choose fish that are low in mercury, including salmon, shrimp, pollock, and tuna, light canned tilapia, catfish, and cod. Avoid these types of fish, so shark, swordfish, tilefish, orange roughy, which I actually like. And when you're eating fish that you or others have caught, pay attention to fish advisories for the stream or wherever it is that you are fishing. And that should be limited. Pesticides. We're going to circle back to pesticides. So we know why pesticides are used, right? They're used in agriculture to eliminate pests and to increase crop yield. They include insecticides, which kill insects, herbicides, which kill weeds, fungicides, which kill fungus, and rodenticides. We've been using pesticides since the 1940s. They are regulated by the EPA. Early synthetic pesticides were pretty nasty. They didn't break down, but those that are used today do. They're less persistent in the environment, so they're safer. Biopesticides have been developed to be even safer alternatives. We have microbial pesticides, GM plants that produce their own pesticides, biochemical pesticides. The problem with pesticides, organisms can become resistant to the pesticide, which means that we have to use more to get the same effect, or we have to develop new pesticides because our old ones aren't working. There can be also something called pesticide drift, where you might be using pesticide on one farm, but the wind, can carry that pesticide to non-target sites, and so you can end up harming non-target species, or pesticide could end up on neighboring farms that are maybe organic, and so that's a problem. Pesticides can also remain in the soil or groundwater. They can end up in aquatic habitats. They can disrupt natural wildlife habitats. And the last one I kind of already said, they can harm non-target species, not just other plants, but bees, for example, are harmed by pesticides. Some frogs, fish. So we can also see a decrease in biological diversity, which is a problem for the environment. Regulation of pesticides. They're regulated. There's a shared responsibility. They're regulated by the EPA, the FDA, and the USDA. So there's 3 different agencies involved here. The EPA determines if a pesticide is beneficial. They determine that if it doesn't pose a health risk or a risk to the environment, and then they set limits on how much may be used on food during growth and processing, and how much can remain on food once it gets to consumers. The FDA and the USDA test foods for pesticides, and they enforce the EPA pesticide tolerances. So again, we call it a pesticide residue or a pesticide tolerance. The pesticide left on food once it is going to go to consumers. The latest USDA report indicates that more than 99% of the samples tested had residues below the EPA tolerances, which is great. So, we're not getting exposed to high levels of pesticides by consuming foods that have been sprayed. In fact, 30% of the samples tested had no detected residues, and less than 1% exceeded pesticide tolerances, which that's not great, right? It's great that it's less than 1%, but we want it to be 0. Imported fruits and veggies actually tend to have higher amounts than those grown domestically. So, foods grown in the USA tend to have lower pesticide tolerances, pesticide residues. Minimizing exposure to pesticides. Chronic exposure to pesticides, so these would be farmers, right? Not us. Chronic exposure to pesticides, farmers, is linked to higher rates of asthma, Parkinson's disease, prostate cancer, leukemia, and other cancers. There has been scientific evidence that has shown this link. Much more research is needed for determining the effects of long-term exposure in much lower doses. So in our diets, right now there's no scientific evidence. There's not a lot of scientific evidence, one way or the other. So to minimize exposure, there is kind of this unknown. Wash and peel fruits and vegetables. Again, latest reports have shown very minimal pesticide residue. And so still wash and peel fruits and vegetables, if not for pesticides, for microbes. Trim away fat and meat because pesticides tend to get stored there. Select a variety of foods so that you're having a lot of different foods that will have different pesticides, so you're not getting exposed to the same pesticide. And then maybe organic foods, but that's still a big question mark. Are they nutritionally better? Is there a benefit to the cost? Okay. Infants and young children, special consideration here because they've got smaller bodies, so they consume relatively higher doses of pesticides per body weight. They may not metabolize pesticides as readily as adults because their liver is still immature. So that would be of most concern. Lastly, we're just about done. Antibiotics. So farmers that raise animals, many will give a low dose of antibiotics. This promotes growth and it prevents and treats disease. The problem, 80% of the antibiotics sold in the United States are used in this fashion. These are the same antibiotics that are used to treat human infections. So here's where the problem lies. This overuse of antibiotics is leading to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which is a huge, major public health concern. Antibiotic use is prohibited in organically raised animals, and so there's a benefit. The less antibiotics that are used in this fashion, the less chance of developing antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 3.